For me, to be invited by Bial, my old colleague, and not my old, my colleague from a while ago. And I've taken his cue with this embracing complexity. We used to say in lab meetings that you have to be uncomfortable with your own ignorance, or uncertainty is a nicer way of saying it, in order to work in this field. And I'm going to try to give some examples of that. So for the last 10 or 11 years, I've been trying to get a molecule that's, I think, going to be a disease-modifying molecule for a form of Parkinson's disease, a genetic form of Parkinson's disease, from discovery to a real clinical trial, which means 1 year, hundreds of patients. And we're about to do that this spring. So that part of my life hopefully is checked, and there's great neurologists in charge, so I can get on with more uncertainty. But I think there's some examples in that, in what I learned over the last 10 years. I thought I knew this lesson when I went in, but I really didn't, and I've learned it over and over again. Wait, why is this not advancing? Maybe it's because I have to move this down here.
Click on it.
Oh, there we go. I don't know what I did, but I'll try to do that again. Anyway, the first thing I put on the first slide is just that Parkinson's disease is a heterogeneous entity. And so for us who are sort of basic scientists who are used to thinking about things that are well-defined, Parkinson's disease is not a word we should be using, really. And I'll tell you some examples of why that's the case. I mean, Parkinson described it in 1830 or something like that. He was across the park from the person who he never talked to the patients who he was writing about. So it's really not helpful in some ways to use that word Parkinson's disease, because what I think it does is it forces us to lump things that shouldn't be lumped, and we lose out on some of the interesting stuff. But I'm going to talk about one form of Parkinson's disease, and that is a Parkinson's disease form that's associated with a mutation in the gene called GBA1, which encodes the lysosomal enzyme called glucocerebrosidase, or GCase. And it is the fact that this is a risk factor for Parkinson's. So if you carry a single copy of a mutant allele, your risk, depending on the mutation, varies somewhere between 2 and 15-fold lifetime risk. All right? So if you think about the math, that means that most people who carry these mutations actually never have a problem with that mutation. Most people don't. But the people that do, it turns out they progress more rapidly. And this is the key here. This is the only gene that's been, in Parkinson's disease, that's been confirmed to affect the risk of onset, or the age at onset, and the rate of progression. And the reason I've been sort of bothering people with these questions here is that when you do a clinical trial, you're assessing rate of progression. It's very hard to get the financing and enthusiasm and people to look at a prevention trial if you haven't first shown that you can modify the rate of progression. So this is the only gene that I know of. Synuclein, the SNPs do not affect rate of progression. They affect age at onset, but not rate of progression. Okay? So here is a cartoon showing sort of an idealized version. This is what I used to show people at the beginning, right? Because I was making money. And as to the fact that the GBA-PD progresses considerably more rapidly than idiopathic PD, and also more uniformly, right? And that means because the placebo group is rapid and both groups are going to be more uniform, your stats will tell you you need a lot fewer patients for a shorter amount of time to run a trial. So you can reasonably run a trial. We're going to run a trial with 240 patients, 80 each in placebo and 2 doses. And we think we have an 80% chance of seeing a 40% slowing in the rate of progression. So that's a big deal, and I'm going to show you why it was much more clear in 2013 than it is today. And then we thought, okay, this is an enzyme, right? A simple enzyme. It hydrolyzes glucose to provide ceramide. So if you have a loss of activity, you should have less glucose and more ceramide. I was so proud of myself, right? That's like very simple and reductionist. Well, the first thing that's true is that there are many forms of ceramides. So ceramides have the sphingosine core that can be unsaturated or not, or saturated. That has a huge effect on its physical properties. And then it has an acyl chain that can be 14 carbons, 16, 18, 20, et cetera, et cetera. So there are many different forms. And the enzyme processes each of those forms slightly differently. Right? So they have different KMs, different Vmaxes. And if you mess with the enzyme, you're not messing uniformly with all of those. So that's a level of complexity that I won't continue on with, but I want you guys to be aware of that. So here is the real progression data. So where did we get this? Well, we got this data from the the PPMI, where they followed patients over time. And we only looked at patients in that database who had 3 exams, so we could have a line to express progression. And all 3 exams were in what we call the practical off state. It means they were 12 hours without any dopaminergic medication. So you're getting close to their baseline movement level. And they were evaluated by, in this case, UPDRS-3, which is more of a toe tapping and nose touching exercise, and UPDRS-2, which is more of like asking the patient, did you have trouble feeding yourself? Did you have trouble buttoning your shirt, et cetera? At any rate, you can see the variability is enormous, right? And this is the PPMI data. So the N370S is a mutation that's very common in Ashkenazi Jews. Some of those patients progress more rapidly, some progress more slowly than an idiopathic Parkinson's patient. So it turns out to be much more complicated. And we thought that the rate of progression would correlate directly with the loss of function. That is, the more loss of function, the faster rate of progression. That's not necessarily always true. So when you're making up a clinical trial, and our clinical trial, the question is, what is your trial population? Well, I voted for having the severe group. The problem is there are about 2% of the US PD population. So we could go to Japan or China where they're about 6 or 10% of the population, but that creates so much, and we don't really have a reason to suspect right now which would be the most responsive group. So what we're doing is we're doing a trial with all comers, and we're trying to balance the 2 groups with respect to genotype, and then at the end, in the post hoc analysis, we're going to pull out things. The other thing is, how do you measure this? Well, I mentioned the UPDRS-2, which is shown here in the 2s. These are the daily activity. This is a questionnaire that the patients fill out. This is what the FDA will now insist on as a primary endpoint for every Parkinson's clinical trial. Now, the people in this room, we can't imagine a messier endpoint than asking somebody if they had trouble buttoning their shirt. Like my father had some form of PD, and he was like completely immobile, and he's like, oh, my shirt's fine, no problem, So it's really a mess, but that is what they want to see because they want to know that the endpoints that you're measuring are meaningful to the patient. But now here's, the other things are all in UPDRS-3. There are all these physician-administered tests. They're paid into an amalgamated score, and you get some number. And we went in and looked at all of these individually, and this is just some of what we saw. These are the same 3 patients. They're all GBA-PD patients. And the first thing that was really interesting to me is tremor, which is the slow rolling tremor that everyone associates, including Parkinson's, with the disease, doesn't progress at all in GBA-PD. Right? You can see that all the patients are pretty much the same. So if you ran a trial with tremor as your endpoint, you'd be sunk. Right? If you include it in your endpoint is weaker. So we've been thinking a lot about how could you make a more refined endpoint, right, that more reflects the patients that you want to treat who have the metabolic problem, which is low GCase activity, that you're interested in treating. So for instance, gait is a really good one because gait speed is important to everybody. You don't have to make an argument why people need to be able to move more easily, and you can measure it remotely. So they have all these methods now where you can measure a Parkinson's patient 24 hours a day and get a really good rounded view of their gait speed instead of having them go in every 6 months to a neurologist and they're all fired up. Again, my father used to walk great in the neurologist's office, and my brother and I would take him aside, the guy aside, and say, look, that's not how he walks in real life. And he would go, I know that, so I applied a discount. Well, So anyway, back to the simplistic. This was our simplistic view of how to do this at the beginning. And these kind of diagrams appeared in many reviews, right? That is, glucir to ceramide is catalyzed by GCase. We want to activate that enzyme, so our compound, which we call BI28, is an allosteric activator. It increases the activity of GK. There's another reaction, ceramide to glucir, which is in some ways the opposite reaction. And maybe if you inhibit that reaction, you would get the same output as if you accelerate the other reaction. That makes sense, right? If it's all just about glucir and cir. Well, it turns out it's not, because Sanofi developed an inhibitor of that, and it accelerates progression of Parkinson's disease. Actually, very clearly accelerates, right? So it's more complicated than this, unfortunately. This is getting towards the level of complexity that you have to be. So there's two places where glucir and cir are in the cell. In the lysosome, everything's going one way, degradation, right? All the sugars are removed down to ceramide, then sphingosine. Then you take it back out to ceramide in the cytosol. Now you build it back up, right? And so the enzyme that we're attacking is a lysosomal enzyme, which is the one that's deficient in the disease. The enzyme that Sanofi was attacking is a cytosolic, or maybe an ER enzyme, that is not deficient in the disease. In fact, there's no genetics around it whatsoever. So we started thinking about what's important about this cycle, this recycling pathway. And it turns out that it looks like this recycling pathway's role is just to keep a ready supply of ceramide. You want to keep, over time, you want to have enough ceramide because there are actually other branches of this pathway through sphingomyelin. There's gangliosides, there's GAL-CIR. There's all sorts of important things that start with ceramide. You need to have a lot of it there all the time. And so we thought that it's rather than the enzyme reaction itself, it's the system. You need to keep the system healthy, and you need to keep generating ceramide. And so in this model, our drug should have a good effect on increasing flux to the system. The Sanofi drug should have a terrible effect, which is decrease flux through the system. And in fact, I told you, it very clearly accelerates disease progression. So this was one level of complexity. The other piece I'm going to talk about more comes here. So this is when we first started, I told all our potential investors, we're going to monitor this drug in our first 1-month trial in GBAPD patients by watching glucir be reduced and ceramide being increased over time. Of course, that didn't happen. This is what happened. And what this is, it's just a very crude heat map, or this is actually a cluster analysis where patients are the columns. And this was a 40-patient trial where 30 of them are on drug, 10 of them are on placebo. They're all GBAPD. And then the rows are different pairs of metabolite and time. So we measured the metabolites over time and compared them to the pre-dose level. This is, I never thought this would come up, but there was a time-dependent effect. It just, and I should have thought about this because I'm supposed to be a chemist. So there was a time-dependent effect. So the cluster analysis correctly identified clusters that were based on time and based on substrate. It also sorted patients, and I don't show you exactly where patients are, but you can see these columns. Most of the placebo groups were on the left here. Most of the drug patients were on the right here. The changes are significant. They occur in about 7 to 14 days. There are sort of two things that happen. They occur, and then there seems to be what I would call an equilibration or another effect. So there's two effects. There's an acute effect and a general effect, which we believe is a response to that acute change in order to rebalance the system. And based on that, I'm not going to get more into that, but I am into stuff like this. This would have killed me back when we were together, Hillel, because I'm a very, I like that one A goes to B thing, but this kind of analysis I think is really useful. We're looking at all the ratios here. I can tell you we have detected a ratio that seems unique, and it describes two patients, and we're pushing that. So we have AI guys really looking at this data. But instead, I want to go off on a little bit of a tangent since you're my friends and I want to try out ideas here. So if there's a pathway that's important in maintaining mitochondrial, it's essentially membrane adaptability. So you have to change the composition of your membranes as you age, and everyone knows we do. That's a known fact. So that the properties can stay within acceptable limits. The properties meaning fluidity, meaning thickness, meaning permeability, meaning curvature, incredibly important property. We never think about this shit. And by the way, that's the end of the talk, is that we never think about membranes. But all of this stuff is really important. So how does this work? And what's really interesting to me is that this enzyme is very sensitive to lipid composition and membrane curvature in vitro systems. So that's interesting to me, because if you were Mother Nature and wanted to design a system that modulated membrane composition, you would regulate it by having it feel membrane composition and regulate itself. And that's the way the system works. And I'm going to show you an example of this in a second. So this is showing that the curvature is really important. So maybe the GCase itself and maybe many of these enzymes sense the membrane curvature, and they keep it within a given variability. And this stuff's well known in yeast, well studied in yeast. Here's a system that Jonathan Weissman first brought my attention to, really fantastic system. So this is what you do if you get in trouble and your ceramide's too low, right? What you do then is you make it yourself from stearine and palmitic acid, right? This is a system that's always off, always or endogenously off. And the way it's off is because it's inhibited by an endogenous inhibitor called ORMGL3. There it is in this cryo-EM structure. ORMGL3 is shown here. It keeps that thing ready to go, but off. And Jonathan was interested in this because there are mutations in this that map to childhood asthma, which is really interesting. Why is it always off? We can get into that later on. But the interesting thing is it senses ceramide. So when ceramide levels get too low, ORMGL3 dissociates from the complex, and now it starts to make its own ceramide. Ceramide levels start to rise back, and it turns itself off again. I mean, it's really a fantastic thing. And we've been looking very hard now at members in this pathway. There's a lot of stuff. There's mutations in the subunits here. One just was shown to map to childhood onset ALS. One that we know of, I know of, that's mapping to AD, and one that we found that maps with PD. So this is a really important pathway in helping you modulate your membrane properties over time. And this paper came out, which is kind of overselling their data, but I think it's kind of interesting where they're starting. They're looking at healthy centenarians versus normal, let's say, 70-year-olds. And they're finding that healthy centenarians don't use this pathway very much at all. So this is a pathway that I think is interesting. This is, and now how does this relate to PD from what we know? Well, this was, I think, a great paper where they were looking at phospholipase mutations that relate to PD. And at the end, they talk about how in the mutant case, you have shortening of the acyl chains. That leads to changes in the membrane properties, which they think could lead to ejection of synuclein, let's say, into the cytosol where it can do bad stuff. So maybe this is bad stuff. But I think maybe that's just a reporter of bad stuff. And not to make anyone angry here, but maybe the bad stuff is here. Maybe synuclein aggregation reports to us that the membrane is now somehow defective, and that's going to have huge implications for autophagy, for mitophagy, for mitochondrial permeability, et cetera. And the synuclein thing is just an epiphenomenon, or a reporter. We've seen this, people have seen these changes in the same pathway in Alzheimer's in many studies. Here's what I think is an interesting paper. Maybe the changes in presenilin selectivity, if you will, or activity, are driven not only by the rare mutations, but also by changes in membrane. So this is the presenilin cut is right in the middle of the membrane. It's very susceptible to membrane width. So if you lose control of your membrane width, or if it falls out of some normal level, or as you age, you're unable to compensate for those changes in membrane, maybe. So, one thing that I'd like to throw out is just that maybe membranes are really important. And so I'm thinking about the second half of my career now. And that's not really a joke, my wife doesn't appreciate it, it's true, but is I think there's a real opportunity. I think membranes are now, it's like the next frontier for science, right? To go from, no one even talks about membranes. They always say lipids, right? Because they don't want to get complicated. They're like afraid. I mean, I'm afraid too, so don't get me wrong. But I think there's a real chance now to think about all of these genes that are associated with membrane, with lipid turnover, are all affecting membrane composition. And membrane composition could be driving a lot of the phenomena we hear. So we hear about here. So I would like to vote at the NSF that they put a lot of thought into like getting people to make the leap between membrane composition, raft formation. Oh my God, these are scary things, but I think these are things that people need to look at. So I have no idea if I went over. But I could take some questions if people wanted. Did I go over? Oh, we started at a weird time. I'll take some questions anyway.
Question. Who's first?
Hillel's deciding. This is just like it was when he was in my lab.
Hi, Peter. That was great. And I have to say that we published a paper 10 years ago in Molecular Neurodegeneration showing that TNF drives this pathway. It's like putting your foot on the gas pedal because it activates both the acid and the neutral sphingomyelinases. And in dopaminergic neurons, what happens is that you get formation of these deoxysphingoid bases that can't be metabolized. They go to the ER and cause ER stress. And so I think in addition to what's going on with the mutations, the added inflammatory drop is like putting your gas on, foot on the gas pedal.
Like having to use, the first thing that struck me when I read Jonathan's paper about that was, why would you have this elaborate system and then not use it? And it's because sometimes you need it, but most of the time you really don't want to use it. And the deoxys are the prime case. If that system's prone to making mistakes, and if it makes mistakes, those mistakes really are bad. So,
So Peter, what would be the experiment to decouple what is upstream and downstream between GBA effects on membrane and ceramide and synuclein? I mean, I agree with you, actually. I think it's a great idea, is that maybe synuclein aggregation is downstream and is an epiphenomena. But how would you prove that, or how would you untangle that?
Honest, so I joined this effort because Dmitry Kranch founded LTI. I was trying to talk him into leaving academia, and he flipped it on me. And I did it because I thought there was a relationship between GCase and synuclein, because he had that first paper, if you remember, in Cell, that was very well put together. And we spent 2 years on that. It's just not robust. There was no tool that we could not get a ratio, let's say, of synuclein change to GCase change. It wasn't steady. You could certainly see cross 3-point curves. But if you then ask, let's go through a dose range with this compound, or let's go to another compound and see if so I think of it as being distant, and I'm not sure how many steps are between it. And, Eliza, frankly, my feeling is it doesn't, I'm not interested in it. Because for our trial, there's no synuclein. If there was, the one way I would get interested again is if someone had a great synuclein marker for CSF, where they could show that it correlated to disease progression. But since no one has, and I don't think there's many close, maybe, right now, for us, we just say, look, the problem is GCase is low, we're fixing that problem, and then we'll see what happens.
Thank you.
Peter, realizing this was a short talk, you didn't mention compromised lysosomal activity. Do you think that does or doesn't play a role?
Yeah, well, there's a lot, as you know, there's a lot of genetics around other enzymes in this pathway. They happen to be in the lysosomal part of the pathway. And I think it's because that's where people find them, because those are coming from Tay-Sachs disease and Niemann-Pick AB and all these genetic lysosomal recessive disease. So, but there are. So we would think that moving things through that pathway, that's what really got me convinced, was like, it's not about the particular substance, it's any enzyme where you lose function in that degradative pathway increases risk of Parkinson's. Now, we don't know yet that any of those others also increase the rate of progression. We don't know. But now we're looking elsewhere in the pathway, Jeff, and we're finding things on the synthetic side too.
Yeah.
So too little synthesis and too little degradation, it's gonna, bad.
Here.
Yeah.
So it was a beautiful talk, and I liked your membrane idea and rafting, all that's coming there. But the problem was the membrane is getting defective. Shouldn't you have lots of other diseases coming together, like metabolic diseases and lots of other things that base if you have a problematic membrane? Should it would be just all this PD?
I think there are lots of symptoms that are shared between AD and PD, but then you make.
But you could have like or metabolic disease or stuff like that. You think if your membrane is in trouble, all these things will come together.
Yeah, I mean, the specificity issue is a problem. I just think that with sort of big numbers and convergent factors, you can get things that look different, even though the changes might not be big.
No, I buy with you that's maybe a quantitative question or a qualitative one. Some things may.
Diabetes and PD, there's some link there. Right. So type 2 diabetes and PD, there's an interesting link. It is possible, in my thinking, that some of these things, cardiovascular disease, these are the two diseases where these deoxys that you're talking about are so, yeah, I think, but look, this is incredibly complicated. I can't even pretend to understand. It's so complicated. We need people.
No, it's a very interesting story.
And create convergence.
And you need numbers, not just.
The thing that's attractive to me, though, is the enzymes that can be modulated here. You might not have to do have big changes to have a big change in a membrane property, and a lot of them are druggable, which is what's. One final question.
I talk like this.
Sure.
I know the complexity you're talking of because I've worked with these pathways in Niemann-Pick disease,
Oh, yeah.
TREM2 gangliosidosis, etc. And I haven't shown the full complexity.
Of course.
2 weeks ago, I got in my news stream, heard of a deal of Biogen and Electus Pharma looking at GBA2 and PD. So you haven't talked about GBA2, but there's a non-lysosomal form of GBA.
Yeah.
And I
We've done a lot of work on
searched
GBA2.
internet, but I didn't find any data on
why
that.
they did
So
that.
what do you think of that?
I don't understand why they did that. They must know something I don't know, because I know there's no genetic association whatsoever.
Yeah.
The enzymes are very different. In our mind, what GBA2 does is there's an equilibrium between ceramide and cholesterol. So if you have a lot of glucose, you make cholesterol. You can only make it from transferring the glucose from ceramide to cholesterol. And that's the GBA2 reaction, that equilibrium. It catalyzes both directions. I don't understand, we've looked a little at glucose cholesterol. Obviously, that would be cool because of the membrane thing. There must be missing data because I don't know.
Okay. I also don't know. So I was just
Okay, are you ready to go?